Hey, this is Paul. I have another Sunday school lesson for you. What is a cause that tugs at your heart? When have you seen or heard about something that made you stop and think, someone ought to do something about that? The truth is, most of us do care, but caring doesn't always lead to action. And sometimes it's not because we're hard-hearted. Sometimes it's simply because we're busy. I'll be honest with you. I miss things sometimes. I forget to put the trash can at the end of the driveway some weeks. I walk into another room to get something and forget why I went in there. Sometimes I forget to do things that Lisa asked me to do. Not because they're not important, but because I've let busyness get in the way. Busyness doesn't usually make us bad people. It just makes us distracted people. And if we're not careful, that distraction can cause us to miss something far more serious than a trash can or a forgotten task. It can cause us to miss the suffering and vulnerability of others, especially people who don't have a voice. The author of the lesson points out something very sobering. Nearly 50 million people, he writes, around the world are trapped in exploitive situations. Today, that would be like modern day slavery, such as an orphan is kidnapped and sold, or people are forced to work with little or no pay. A teenager is threatened into trafficking drugs under the fear of violence. These aren't statistics. These are people. And Scripture is clear. God sees them. The title of today's lesson is Compelled to Act. Compelled to act. We're going to be looking at Job, chapter 31. We'll be looking at verses 13 through 23. The point of the lesson is this: let the fear and majesty of God compel you to look out for others. If we look at Luke 6 and kind of paraphrase in verses 31 through 33, it says, treat others just as you want to be treated. But it also asks us a question. It says, if you are kind only to someone who is kind to you, will God be pleased with you for that? This lesson isn't about guilt or being overwhelmed by the size of the problem. It's about allowing proper reverence for God to shape how we see and respond to people around us. In Job 31, we see God's heart for the oppressed reflected through Job's life. Job didn't just believe the right things, he acted on them. He helped those who couldn't help themselves. He sought justice for those who were treated unfairly. He refused to ignore the poor, the fatherless, and the widowed. Job lived with a constant awareness that God was holy, just, and watching, not to trap him, but to guide him. If we look at Isaiah chapter 1 and kind of paraphrase in verses 16 and 17, we see that we are to seek justice and defend the oppressed and take up the cause for the fatherless. I want you to see Job's mindset as he begins chapter 31. He places his entire life before God. He invites God to weigh him on the scales of justice. Job believes he has lived a life with integrity, but he also knows that God sees what others cannot. So he says, if there's hidden sin in my life, let me bear the consequences. If my outward faith doesn't match my inward life, then I deserve judgment. I am not asking God to look away. I'm asking him to look closely. As Job begins verse 13, he turns to how he treated others, especially the vulnerable. The question before us isn't what did Job do? It's this: what might God be asking us to notice and act on today? So Job 31, verses 13 through 15, Job is saying, if I have been unfair to my male and female servants when they brought their complaints to me, how could I face God? What could I say when he questioned me? For God created both me and my servants. He created us both in the womb. So what we see here is Job is making a public defense of his integrity before God. He addresses how he treated those under his authority, his male and female servants. Job says that when his servants brought a complaint against him, he did not dismiss it. He did not ignore it. He did not try to silence them. Instead, he listened. Why? Because Job understood a deeper truth. The same God who formed him in the womb also formed them. And this is a radical idea in Job's culture. Servants had little to no social power, yet Job viewed them as equal in worth, even if not equal in position. His treatment of them wasn't driven by convenience or social norms or his own self-interest. It was driven by his fear of God and his awareness that one day he would have to stand before God and be judged for his actions or his inactions. Job's logic is simple. God is the creator of every human. Therefore, every person has inherent dignity and value. Because God will hold us accountable, Job must treat others justly, especially those with less power. So this passage teaches that how we treat people is ultimately an act of worship. It's obedience, and it makes us accountable before God. Imagine a business owner whose lowest level employee comes in with a concern. The owner has two options: dismiss it because they don't really matter, or stop, listen carefully, and respond with fairness. What determines which path the owner takes isn't policy, it's how they see the person. Job chose the second path because he didn't see servants as disposable labor. He saw them as people crafted by the same creator who crafted him. He knew that ignoring their voice might be easy in the moment, but impossible to justify when standing before God. That's the heart of this passage. God's presence changes how we treat people when no one else is watching. Our fear of God can reshape our perspective. The fear of God is not terror, it's reverence. Job lived with an awareness that God sees and that God cares and that God judges rightly. That awareness compelled him to act justly towards others. But here's the thing. Passages like this sound good, but they're hard to live out in the culture we're in. We see people standing outside stores with signs, and we wonder, are they truly in need? Or are they taking advantage of kindness? Asking that isn't the problem. Asking that question isn't the problem. The danger is letting suspicion turn into indifference. We want to be helpful, but trust issues and busyness and distraction get in the way. Job challenges not to let suspicion or fatigue harden our hearts. Job didn't claim to solve every problem, but he refused to dismiss people or strip them of their dignity. Jesus never healed everyone, but he never ignored anyone. The question isn't whether we can fix every situation, it's whether the fear of God keeps us compassionate and attentive to the people around us. Our motives driven by convenience are what honors God? Are your motives driven by convenience or what honors God? Job teaches us that belief always leads to behavior. If we truly believe every person is God's handiwork from the womb, then how we treat others is not optional. It's obedience. That's what it means to be compelled to act. Well, in these next verses, we will see more of how we are accountable for how we help those who can't help themselves. Job 31, verses 16 through 20. Job again writing, "Have I refused to help the poor or crushed the hopes of the widow? Have I been stingy with my food and refused to share it with the orphans? No. From childhood, I have cared for orphans like a father, and all my life I have cared for the widows. Whenever I saw the homeless without clothes and the needy without nothing to wear, did they not praise me for providing wool clothing to keep them warm?" So what we see here is Job continues his defense by listing specific, concrete actions that demonstrated how he lived out justice and compassion. So Job names 5 forms of neglect that he refused to commit. 1, he did not turn away from the poor when they had legitimate needs. 2, he did not ignore the widows who lacked protection and provision. And 3, he did not eat his food alone while orphans went hungry. And 4, he did not watch people suffer from cold without clothing them. And then 5, he did not hoard his resources, but shared from what God had given him. At the heart of this passage is Job's understanding that blessings create responsibility. Job recognized that what he had, food and clothing and livestock and influence, was not meant only for his comfort. God had entrusted him with abundance so he could meet the needs of those who had none. Job also understood that vulnerability isn't theoretical, because hunger and cold and isolation are immediate and dangerous realities. So when Job saw a need, he acted. Compassion was not delayed, compassion was not debated or delegated. It was practiced. This passage shows that righteousness is not merely avoiding wrongdoing, it is actively doing good, especially for those who cannot help themselves. Imagining opening your closet on a cold winter morning. You have multiple coats, some you rarely wear. Now imagine seeing someone shivering outside in a thin jacket. Job understood this. When he saw someone without a cloak, he didn't say, "Well, that's unfortunate," or, "Well, someone else should help." He gave from what he had. And this illustration reminds us that possession is not ownership, it is stewardship. James 2, verses 15 and 17, kind of paraphrase, says, "If we notice a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food, so we see the need, but if we only offer words instead of help, it tells us that our faith is empty." Or Proverbs 31, again paraphrasing verses 8 and 9, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves." Scripture is clear. God holds us accountable for what we do with our resources. Job knew he would have to answer to God not only for harm he had caused, but for help that he had withheld. Silence, indifference, and inaction all count as moral choices. So you have to ask yourself, what has God placed in your hands? Time, money, influence, skills that you could use to help someone else. Job doesn't say he helped when it was easy or when it cost him nothing. He helped because it was right. Compassion often interrupts our comfort. Some of our common excuses for not stepping up to help out is because we say, "Oh, we don't know the whole story," or "I've worked hard for what I have," or "someone else will take care of that." Job's life challenges those excuses that we use. He didn't wait for perfect clarity. He responded to the visible need. And so this lesson shows us that our faith becomes visible through our actions. Some practical steps that we might take could be that we look intentionally for needs around us this week, or we share from our abundance, or we refuse to overlook people who are easily overlooked. If we believe God is the giver of every blessing, then those blessings come with responsibility. The fear and majesty of God should not lead us to retreat, but to act. We are accountable for how we help those who can't help themselves. That's what it means to be compelled to act. In this last passage of our lesson, we see that we are also accountable to seek justice for those who are treated unjustly. So let's look at Job 31. We'll finish up with verses 21 through 23. And again, Job saying, "If I raised my hand against an orphan, knowing the judges would take my side, then let my shoulder be wrenched out of place. Let my arm be torn from its socket." That would be better than facing God's judgment. So what we see here is Job addresses not just personal compassion, but public justice. He moves from this private acts of mercy to how he used or refused to use his authority. Job imagines a courtroom scene at the city gate, the place where legal decisions were made. As a respected leader, Job had influence. If he raised his hand, others would follow. He could have easily voted against a fatherless child and secured a conviction simply because the child had no defender. But Job insists he never did that. Why? Because he feared God. Job understood two truths. Two truths that Job understood is one is God sees how power is used. God sees how we use our power, our influence. And God judges those who exploit the vulnerable. Job's conviction was so strong that he pronounced a curse against himself if he ever abused his authority, essentially saying that he deserved to lose the very strength that he misused. This passage teaches that to remain silent or passive when injustice occurs is itself a moral failure. Job's reverence for God compelled him to stand up even when it would have been easier or more popular or definitely more convenient not to have stood up and spoke out. Job knew his voice carried weight. He had influence. If he spoke against a fatherless child, others' opinions would follow, and justice would be lost. Each of us has influence, and with that comes responsibility and accountability. Job knew he would answer to God for how he used his influence. That applies to everyone with authority, parents and supervisors, leaders. We may not all have authority, but we all have influence. So, where has God given you influence, and how are you using it? Job also knew that seeking justice might isolate him, but God's judgment mattered more than public approval. Today, standing for justice may mean speaking up when others stay quiet, or refusing to go along with an unfair system. Maybe defending someone who can't defend themselves. So, what keeps you silent when you should be speaking up? Job teaches us that neutrality in the face of injustice is not righteousness. God's people are called to actively seek justice, not merely avoid wrongdoing. This lesson leaves us with a sobering question. When justice threatens someone who can't fight back, will we raise our hand or refuse to? When we step back and look at Job 31 as a whole, we see that Job's actions didn't come from impulse or emotion. They flowed from conviction. Job lived with the awareness that God sees, God creates, and God judges rightly. That awareness shaped how he treated people when it mattered most. If we looked at Psalms 139, it helps us to understand why this matters. In this passage, David reminds us that every human life is intentionally formed by God. He says it's knitted together in the womb. No life is accidental, no person is disposable. Human value is settled long before status or strength or usefulness ever enters the picture. That's why Job could say the God who formed him also formed the servant, the orphan, and the widow. Job also wasn't so busy that he wasn't observant. Imagine yourself driving through town and coming upon a flashing yellow light. The light isn't telling you to stop, but it is telling you to slow down. Look carefully and pay attention. Something here matters. Job's lived his life as if the light was always flashing. When a servant brought him a complaint, Job slowed down to listen. When an orphan was hungry or a widow was vulnerable, Job paid attention. When power could have been used unfairly, Job restrained himself. He didn't rush past people because of position or convenience or suspicion. The fear and majesty of God caused him to notice what others might overlook and to respond when it would have been easier not to. But here's the problem, and you probably noticed it in that illustration. When most of us see a yellow light, we don't slow down. We speed up. When we see a yellow light, we speed up. Why? Because we're busy. We're in a hurry. We want to get where we're going. And when we speed up, we become less aware of our surroundings. That's exactly the danger this lesson has been trying to warn us about. Job slowed down not because he had extra time, but because he knew he wasn't the center of the story. God was. And when God is at the center, people are no longer interruptions in our lives. They are neighbors made in his image. The fear of God doesn't just change our behavior, it recenters our heart. Our schedules, our goals, our desire for comfort, our sense of importance no longer set at the center. Slowing down often looks like putting others first, laying aside our self-centeredness, laying aside our ego and our pride so that we notice the needs around us. The fear of God replaces the "I don't have time" with "this person matters to God." The scripture speaks with one clear voice on this. Psalms tells us every life has God-given value. James tells us real faith shows itself through actions. And Jesus tells us that how we treat the least is how we respond to him. How we treat the least is how we respond to him. That means faith is never just about what we believe. It's about how our belief shapes our behavior. Here's the takeaway this lesson leaves us with. When we understand the sanctity of life, compassion is no longer optional. When faith is real, it doesn't rush past need, it responds. And when we truly fear God, we slow down enough to see people. That's why this next statement is so true. Fearing God loosens our grip on self-importance and opens our eyes to the people he has placed in our path. That is what Job understood. That's what the scripture affirms. And that is what it means to be compelled to act. When we truly fear God, we slow down enough to see people. The sanctity of human life flows from the truth that every person is created in the image of God and known by him from the womb to natural death. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan formally recognized this biblical truth by proclaiming January 22nd as Sanctity of Human Life Day. A reminder we still observe today. Jesus affirmed this value through his words and his actions by caring for the vulnerable, the forgotten, and the powerless. Because every life bears God's image. Believers are not called to passive belief, but are compelled to act, to protect, value, and defend human life, whatever threatens it. Well, I'll close with this quote. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing, by Edmund Burke. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. And I hope you have a great week.